Welcome, everyone. Today we're asking a simple but important question. What, if anything, does philosophy uniquely bring to us? Lots of things people associate with philosophy, critical thinking, questioning, reflection, and so on, can happen outside of philosophy. So what does philosophy itself offer? Or does it even need a unique selling point? Does philosophy matter now? If so, why or how does it matter?
Okay. Well, it does and it doesn't matter, it depends on what it is we're talking about here. Of course, philosophy has always mattered and matters now and will always matter simply because we need to think about stuff. So ultimately, philosophy very basically is about thinking, critically thinking, about various issues in our lives. And that is super, super important. There are also other kinds of philosophy, sort of more specific academic questions. They also matter. They matter within a particular context, within the context of academia. But I think, I mean, the unique power of philosophy is that it really, as a method, matters so much outside of the academic context. And it is in that context that I think we need it so much today. The reason is why perhaps we need it particularly today that the quality of public discourse is not good, and philosophy is quite well positioned to help with this. It's not enough. We need people who are enthusiastic about discussing things and who are willing to engage in conversations. But philosophy is pretty good at giving us some sort of pointers of how we can talk about things in a constructive way. So Plato's big thing was to talk about important issues in an atmosphere of goodwill. So constructively talking. And I think that's the biggest thing we can learn from philosophy, and that's the sense in which philosophy matters most today.
Yeah, I do think philosophy matters now today, for all the same reasons it used to matter across the ages. However, I think there is an extra contemporary context to that. We live in an age which is oversaturated with information. We've never had so much information around, and in our lives, we have never had so much access to information and the need to process information. Um, it can be really overwhelming and confusing. First, this overload of information, then all the competing narratives about the information. So, how to make sense of all that, how to connect all those things and filter out the noise and test it for salience, for whether things that are being presented to us are, facts, opinions, values, or something else. Whether they're true or false, whether they make sense at all, whether they connect to each other, whether one thing follows from the other, whether they rely on some implicit or unspoken assumptions that we need to have a second look at and think whether we actually agree with them or not. And philosophy is a really good tool for this thought hygiene. I think in the age where, we need it more than ever. So it's basic, maybe a tool for human understanding, sort of gives us an opportunity, yeah, to slow down and process things as best as we can.
So, is there something more? Well, if I were to put it into one word, I would say probably understanding is the thing that philosophy brings. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that because, of course, understanding is part of all education and all the things that we are studying or subjects and disciplines. So, so I'd like to make a distinction between two kinds of understanding: understanding something in particular and understanding in the more general sense. Understanding something in particular, I might be trying to understand how to work my phone, as my daughter's always telling me I don't really understand it, or I might be trying to understand how to play an instrument or how to do long division. These are specific things we're trying to understand. And I think largely education, for instance, is teaching us those kinds of understandings in the different disciplines. But understanding in the more general sense It isn't something that we learn, for instance, at school when we're doing these things. We don't understand or learn how history or geography or science or music and art all go together to try to help us understand the world, which in a sense they are doing in different ways. So I think that the thing for me is that sort of sense of understanding in a from a synoptic bird's eye view. How does all this connect up, and how does it help me to understand things and understand the world and each other? So, in that sort of broader sense, I would like to draw upon Wilfred Sellers, who I think gives us a wonderful way of knitting this into one simple sentence. And he says that philosophy is sort of considering how things, in the broadest possible sense, hang together in the broadest possible sense. And I think that captures nicely this idea of understanding in that sense. And I think philosophy does that in a way that no other subject does.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's true, but I also think it kind of does the opposite. So I think, yeah, yes, it's true. So philosophy helps us make connections and helps us sort of think about how things hang together. But also, and perhaps more importantly, it's really something we can learn from reading Kant, by the way. Um, it shows us limitations. You know, it also shows us where the limits lie, the limits of our own understanding. So I don't just mean in a technical sense, in the way that Kant means, but you know, more generally. So things that really are not accessible if we use particular approaches. You know, so the different disciplines that you've mentioned. So it's not just important to see how they all add up, and then we've got this fuller picture, but also to see where their limitations lie. And it's true that, you know, philosophy in a way is a kind of meta discipline, right? So philosophy is not, of course, like other disciplines, you know, defined by what it is about, but you know, there's a particular approach there which allows us to kind of move quite freely. But I also think this critical thinking that's so core to philosophy is very much there to define limits. And I think that's one of the most important things we can learn. You know, so really to think how far can we go, what can we expect to understand, and where do we have to say, okay, you know, this is not working, let's find something else.
So I do think that other areas of knowledge, let's say sciences, etc., and arts for that matter, they all they all help us understand the world around us in their own ways. So philosophy is not unique in its project. However, coming back to this idea of assumptions, I think that's quite key, because I think every other sort of discipline, yeah, every other way of knowing the world relies on a very particular set of axioms or assumptions which are specific to that discipline, and therefore it will be applying that kind of certain set of filters to the reality. I think philosophy is probably the discipline which is also routinely looking at its own assumptions as it goes. I mean, other disciplines check them every now and then, you know, paradigm shifts in science and all that. But for philosophy, it's just part of business as usual. And I think that what makes it really valuable. And also, it can work with several sort of, you know, with several ways and with several set of assumptions, looking at the world at the same time, be comparing them, be kind of checking what works best and coming back and testing them. Again, to an extent, other disciplines are also doing that. But I think philosophy is just the discipline where it's inbuilt into the actual process of philosophizing, and part of its rigor is that self-reflection. And it also teaches us as human beings to do the same thing. Yeah. So we looking at the world with that rigorous lens, we learn to look at ourselves with that rigorous lens. So this constant attention to the observer, while very often I think in other areas, the observer kind of has been somehow taken for granted or ignored. Not everywhere, but more often than not.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you know, so Alex mentioned paradigm shifts, and I thought that was actually really interesting. So in science, we're required to rethink and find a new approach, and to be, you know, self-critical of what we're doing, particularly when things come to a halt. But that's also because we kind of think that within the natural sciences, you know, we progress in our understanding of the world, or whichever aspect a particular science, you know, takes as its object. And at some point we can't progress any further. We just sort of spend all our time patching up the old theories and sort of trying to keep a structure together that perhaps doesn't hold anymore. But in philosophy, of course, it doesn't work like that. We're always and constantly critical. But I wonder whether this also means that we're a bit circular. So is that perhaps a problem of philosophy? Is that where, perhaps philosophy doesn't do so well? When we can say, well, in the sciences and, in the natural sciences, we can see how we've progressed. The sciences give us all this technology, give us all these possibilities. Things get better and better. And in philosophy, kind of, this doesn't happen. So I wonder whether the critical element of philosophy, which is so valuable, is also a matter of circularity and perhaps also holds us back in some way.
So first of all, this circularity issue, well, I think that this can to some extent be addressed by thinking about philosophy's relationship to other disciplines. If we think of philosophy as just on its own, doing its own thing, then I think it's more in danger of that kind of circularity, lack of progress, and so on. However, if we see philosophy as, like the ancient Greeks did, as just part of the whole project, and this again ties in with my earlier point about how it sort of, its relationship to all those other disciplines and other ways of thinking, then of course it just becomes that the progress is made by those other things as part of a broader philosophical project thought about in this perhaps more general epistemological sense. So I think if we integrate philosophy with everything else in terms of how we're learning to know the world and how we're approaching knowing how to know the world and so on, then I think it can perhaps get out of that problem as the other subjects become the footholds to the next level.
I do completely agree with that philosophy is not an alternative to scientific way of thinking about the world, or maybe, other sort of epistemic frameworks about thinking about the world, but it kind of glue that unites all of them. And, we must remember, of course, that before sciences emerged independently, there was natural philosophy, right? So philosophers were thinking about these questions before the scientific method and more specific sort of empirical tools came about in order to be able to test those thoughts. I think a contemporary philosopher needs to be informed scientifically in as much as sort of practical about the things they're talking about philosophically. Uh, Otherwise, they're not doing a very good job. Yeah, so the job of the philosopher these days, rather than sort of hypothesize in a vacuum, is to be building those bridges and seeing those connections between those disciplines where they themselves may not be quite there yet, even if some of them then need to be tested empirically where possible. Uh, and as I said earlier, but also questioning those foundations, because sometimes individual disciplines become too comfortable on their own foundations and sort of start taking them for granted.
Yeah, philosophy is a kind of leg up in a way to those other disciplines. Think about when they get stuck, like in the Middle Ages, the scientific project was stuck with being religious, and philosophy sort of helped to question that.
Oh no, no, sorry. I just noticed we're all wearing black, so I don't know whether we're all going for this cool Sartrean look or whether secretly
And it
we're
needed to be
actually in mourning
turtlenecks.
of philosophy. We kind of think maybe philosophy is not doing so well, but then on the other hand, I can see you're both quite optimistic. We have to be careful because, I think a lot of people get sort of cheesed off with this idea that philosophy sort of elevates itself about all these other disciplines and says, oh well, we're holding everything together, So I think it'd be quite interesting to
Yeah.
have a discussion, and maybe we can do that at another point. But how philosophy stands relative to those other ways of thinking about the world.
If I may do some of the things you've been talking about, so you know about the limits and the assumptions, which are both really important points, I think. But what we could do is we could say, well, what are the assumptions? And very often, I think one assumption is that philosophy has is that it is sort of underpinned by reason, and reason, critical thinking, and so on are the sort of things that we work with in all cases. And I would like to sort of offer a challenge to that, because I do know that these days there's a lot of sort of challenge to the notion that reason is the thing which can solve things. And I suppose we've had this ever since the sort of post-enlightenment sort of thinking. And I've got there's two short definitions that I like of my own that I've come up with. One is that philosophy is everything, comma, within reason. But I think in a sense, this shows us that we have that assumption. It brings that assumption in, that it is within reason. Another one I might put, which is slightly different, is all things, comma, considered. Now, I think what's nice about this is that the idea of considering includes reasoning, but I don't think it necessarily is just about reasoning. So I think we could make a case for philosophy doing something which goes beyond just reasoning in the usual critical thinking kind of sense. And this is what we we're getting at the beginning. Critical thinking can be taught without doing philosophy. So what is it that philosophy brings? And perhaps without excluding critical thinking and actually including it, but I think what we might say is that it is a kind of considering, which includes reasoned consideration. But we may then be able to include some of the other approaches to doing philosophy, which are less dependent or less dependent on the assumption that philosophy is a reasoning project, a rational project.
Yes, so first of all, I do have problems. I think having done philosophy for so long and also having tried to look beyond it, I have problems with the idea of reason. I think there's an awful lot in there. Maybe we should have a session about that someday. Someday. I think that would be quite interesting. On the other hand, yeah, I would say that reasoned argument really is the bread and butter of philosophy. So I would say, that really is what it's all about. And I think we need to keep it within those confines. Otherwise, I think otherwise it's just not philosophy.
So we're getting to a necessary condition. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. But is it sufficient as well? I wonder. Is any kind of reasoned argument? I mean, that's the problem with philosophy, isn't it? So we're not talking about definitions of philosophy today, but I think a case could be made that any well-reasoned argument is by its very nature philosophical. Ooh.
It's perhaps an answer to sort of a deep human needs that we have to understand things. So understanding not just as a kind of some sort of practical task, where reason is the best way to achieve this, because then there is a question, why reason? Why understand? And I think philosophy, because it's able to look at all those different things using reason, while the sciences tend to have a very kind of narrow, specific remit of what are the things that they're looking at. Sort of philosophy, I think, is the best to respond to that human need about understanding whatever it is at stake in any particular situation. Or, sometimes it can delegate things to sciences, but sometimes we just don't have enough to be able to try to understand something very specific, maybe interdisciplinary or beyond disciplinary, and also just sort of as a way of connecting with other people who may be wanting to make sense of similar kind of questions. And I think philosophy maybe is the most sort of flexible tool of helping us together, as well as on our own, whoever prefers what, to battle with those questions that really matter to us. And because AI can reason, right? So we ask them a question, gives a very good answer, gives you some reasons for that answer, etc. But it's not coming from that sort of deep-seated need. And I think when I'm thinking at least about philosophy, this is not just a tool, that's also a response to a need, which is the most adequate to the broadest possible sort of remit of those questions that we might be interested to explore with it.
I may make a case for reason in philosophy. Well, if we think about it, if you go back historically, and correct me if I'm wrong on the history here, if you think I am, we've got things like Christianity, for instance. What's special about Christianity was it kind of democratized faith and relationships with God. It wasn't just something which came through a king or a priest class and so on. Suddenly, everyone had some sort of place in the eyes of God and were equal there. It was a democratizing thing. And I think we can say the same thing for what the Greeks brought when they brought us argumentation and systematic rational thinking. from Heraclitus to Parmenides, Socrates, Aristotle, and so on. And in particular, I'll mention Parmenides and Aristotle because they did so much for actually systematizing reasoning in such a way that anyone can then use it. This means that knowledge and understanding and critical engagement with authority suddenly comes to everyone, anyone who is able to read and understand these processes and so on. And these particular guys I mentioned because they wrote so much in the way of formal argumentation and the things that we would now associate with critical thinking. So I'm going to make a case for so philosophy, even if we think it's not necessary to have reasoning at its heart. Some people might say that. I tend to agree with you, Anja, that it is at least necessary. But I think it certainly has its origins. Critical thinking has its origins in philosophy, coming from these early philosophers that gave us these tools. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts the Greeks gave us was critical reasoning.
Absolutely. Well done to the Greeks. Absolutely. Totally cool. But, as philosophers, because, we have these great thinkers of old, I think we have to be just really careful not to sit on our laurels and say, yeah, there were these ancient guys and, they did all this and hey, this is us and that's why philosophy still matters. So we're coming back to the issue of why it matters today. Absolutely. So they started something really great. And, but we also have to, I think, show that this project is still ongoing, so I think that's now down to us, and I think philosophy has to do more. Philosophy really has to get its hands dirty, and I think this is where, not necessarily where I'm critical of well, of course I'm always critical, but where I would say philosophers go wrong, but because a lot of philosophers do get involved. But I really think that's the most important thing philosophy can do in our time. Really get involved with the issues of the day. So philosophy can be applied to all of this, and I think that's really what we ought to be doing. Maybe all of us will do some more of that together as well. That'd be great.
But before we close, one sentence from each of us. What is the single most important thing philosophy brings to human life? Anja.
The most important thing that philosophy brings to human life is the insight that it's important, not just okay, but important to disagree with one another. And also that the world doesn't end when we disagree. On the contrary.
To make sense of things as how they are or how they may be connected to each other, because there may be more than one way, and to be able to spot assumptions behind ideas. I think that's really important.
And I would say, I think I'll repeat what I said earlier, that it's about understanding, but I'll add that it's understanding in a conversational way, but dialectical conversation. So it's not just chat or idle chat. It's important back and forth. I'd like to sort of also draw on Anja's point that she made in response to what I said earlier, that I think it's not just about understanding, but understanding the world is also very much about understanding what it is we don't understand, as well as what we do understand.